Hello. So Kotare's 1/32 scale Spitfire. I hope I pronounced that right. I was corrected last time. This kit was sent by a subscriber, Con George. And once again, I want to thank you very much for sending this kit all the way from Australia. I hope you like the end results. It's a long way to be disappointed. So I'll keep the intro short because I go through a lot about the kit building and what I think through the video build. Talking of which, I'm editing this as I'm recording this, so it's up to about 45 minutes, 50 minutes at the moment. And I've been having a lot of problems with my software. It doesn't like rendering big videos. About 20 minutes, 25 minutes max, it falls over. So this could be a two-parter, even a three-parter, but they will all be released in one go. Not ideal. I'm hoping to have it all rendered in one swoop, much easier for everybody. But that may happen and that may be the case, so I'm sorry about that. It's just one of those things. I must look at getting a new software later on down the line. So this is going to be the last big build from me, and I'm going to try, I hope to, get a few small builds just to keep the channel ticking along. Keep my toes in the water, as they say. But we shall see. So let's take a look and see what I did with these pieces of plastic. Or you could go outside and enjoy the sun. I hope to see you soon. So I was partly through a build when this kit arrived, and I'm not going to go into great depth of what's in the box as this kit's being covered quite widely, but I will give a quick overview. The box does have a wingnuts feel about it. We get three options here. Now the instructions need to be read thoroughly back to back, not something I usually do. I do like the comment about disagreeing about the colours, which is okay, they say here. Colour guide. Frame layout. For a kit this size, not many parts. I might touch on that later. A very comprehensive instruction booklet with colour callouts everywhere. This will save me looking all over the place for the right colours. So I've gone through this guide or booklet a few times, just to get a feel for how they want us to build this kit. There are tips and little bits of info everywhere. And to help you with the build, they've got actual photographs of the aircraft. A very nice touch. I do love the photo of the hand-painted roundel. I wonder if that's what I should do with this kit. If you look at the decals, they're not perfectly round. I do like that. The decals are and look superb. Stencils on the roundels. The used gun coverings, a very nice touch. Separate bezels, printed in Italy, so we should be okay here. Transparent parts, we get a closed and open hood. We get a seat with or without the harnesses, and I think it's a very good idea to get some aftermarket replacements, as good as the kit ones are. The side walls, most of the controls have been moulded in already, which may explain the low part count. Some people will like that, some people won't, which is okay with me. Great surface detail here. How accurate it is, I wouldn't have a clue. Must make sure that these fillets fit perfectly. I can't afford to sand around these areas and lose all that top detail. There are some very nice aftermarket replacements for the exhausts and wheels if you wish. But I'll try and use as many of the kit's parts as possible, for people on a tight budget. So I'm going to start by gluing the exhaust parts first. I know that looks odd and sounds odd. And I'm going to put them to one side, as later on the holes need drilling out. So I've cut loose and cleaned all the parts for steps 1 through to 3. Next, it says you can drill out all the holes in the frames. All the holes, I'm not too sure, or just some of them. And the mounting strut if you wish. I'm going to do that as it gives these parts a bit of depth. You could use a hobby drill if you want, but I prefer the light touch. More control. Ended up going overboard and went wholly mad. Now, because of the shape of the parts of the frames at the back, the holes drilled out look very unsightly. Now, the mounting strut, I was told that not all the holes need drilling out, just the rear ones. So as I alluded earlier, most of the detail is moulded on, like the air bottles. Now, most companies would have treated these parts as separate parts, but for me it's not an issue. This oxygen bottle has quite a mould slip mark on it. But other than that, the sidewalls are very nicely moulded. So I keep getting ready to paint, and then I think, if I'm painting this, I might as well paint these parts as well. So the fuselage halves are being cut and cleaned up. And of course I couldn't resist dry fitting the two halves, which seem to fit very nicely. Some of the detail is lost at the bottom, but I do like the way the top is treated, providing it has no fit issues. So next I need to close up the two access doors. Both these parts fitted very well and looks promising for the rest of the build. Just going to add a bit more definition to the side frames on the side walls here, and I'm not drilling through, just giving it a bit more depth. So I've done quite a bit dry fitting here. I want to see how much I can assemble of this without the painting being hindered. Just adding this to the floor to act as a jig for this assembly. I'm not gluing the seat to the frame, I just want to make sure it all fits before the glue dries. Now, I didn't know whether to add the armour parts here, as I was considering either the PR or the rescue Spit, but because I can't make my mind up, I'm adding them anyway. The flare shoe part had some injector pin marks. Now, you may not see these, but just to play safe, I've covered them up. So I'm just making these slots or holes here wider. It'll just make it easy for me to thread through the cabling later. Just going to let that dry before adding the chutes. Now, if you can get a replacement harness, it's a must at this scale. But I want to show you what the kit's harness looks like when painted. Now, they ask you to cut the harness here on these recesses, but I'm not fanning about with that. And I've just made the slot in the armour plate a lot wider. So I've washed all these parts before I did my first layer of paint, which will be AK's Extreme Metal aluminium. I'm playing safe here and covering as much of the aluminium colour as possible. Now, I know there is no aluminium paint around here, but the first coat will help with the chipping later. The paint looks flecky here, but it's just the camera and the lighting. Honest. Next colour is the interior green. The instructions suggest X28, which is a gloss, and XF71. Now 71 I don't have, but I've decided to make my own mix anyway. There's a surprise. Now looking at the paint guide, there seems to be two greens in the cockpit. An apple green, as they call it, and a grey green, which sounds good to me. It just adds variety to that cockpit. Now talking about the colour instructions, or the call-outs, I found these a bit confusing. No criticism, it's just me. So I've decided to use these two final views as my colour guide. All I've got to do is make sure it looks like this at the end. Much easier than trying to read out those call-outs here, there and everywhere. The relevant areas are all masked off and I can apply my custom green. Now the custom mix is made up of X8, which is a gloss, and XF5. Just a few drops of yellow until I was happy. After seeing the mix applied, I wasn't really happy with it. It was too green. So I decided to add some XF59 just to warm the green up, which worked a treat for me. And as always, before the green paint is set, I've gone over with a toothpick just to take some of that green off to show the AK's metal underneath. The armour plating here should have been painted black, but because I was happy with the chipping effect, I'm going to leave it. Next is the other green, which I've applied to the seat and the control column. Here I've just added some XF19 to the previous mix. Next, all the black areas, air bottles, I knew I'd missed something. I forgot about this part here. But before I can paint it, it needs a slot drilling out for the optional part. Now because I don't know what spit I'm doing, I'm going to add it anyway. So I've picked up all the details by brush. Just need to add these additional parts to the side walls. On this part here, they suggest that you cut the cables and add your own. And as you can see, I didn't do that. The second thing that confused me, looking at the instructions, it looks like they're asking you to bend this part so it fits the side of the fuselage better. And if I understand that to be right, that's what I did. So I've sealed all the surfaces with Tamiya semi-gloss or satin varnish, ready for the washes. I'm going to use one of the Vallejo greys here as a wash for the silver areas, and then a Tamiya panel wash for the green areas. Now the technique for the Vallejo wash is exactly the same as I did for the Heinkel 111 build. So it's only when this Vallejo wash dried that I decided for whatever reason it didn't work. By that time it's too late, the paint's set. But thankfully the Tamiya wash, using a bit of odourless white spirit to blend it in, worked a treat. The decals are next, and there are loads of placards and instrument dials to add. But before I do that, I'm just going to leave all these washes to dry thoroughly before getting on with that. Now the decals were applied and they went down with no issues whatsoever and conformed to the surfaces with very little effort. I used micro set and micro sole just in case. By the way, I still don't know the difference between the two solutions, but it worked. I didn't add all the decals supplied, like these tiny ones. A bit much for me. Now the instructions give you the option to add cabling to the cockpit area. So for your sake, I'm going to give it a go. Normally I wouldn't bother. Let's see. I'm going to add the panel frame first. Then this two-part assembly. Then the control column. Now for the cabling, I was going to use wire, but I decided in the end to use this stuff, painted with Tamiya's micro silver lacquer paint. So you can see I've made a start with the cabling by gluing it on this side first. A very weak point, by the way, but the second one is much easier to attach because of the hole. Just need to thread it through. Next, I need to assemble that seat area. Now I need to attach this backing plate or armour plate to the seat. It's a bit vague on the instructions, but with a bit of force, it did eventually press fit in. Now before I glue the seat assembly to the floor, I need to feed this thread through here and on the slot on this side. So the thread fedded through, I'll glue the frame to the floor. Then I've attached the other two cables to the rear lever here. The chute assembly is next. And I'm just going to let all that set before I thread the cables through here and there. So there we go. That was a nightmare for me. The thread attached to these points doesn't look very good, but I didn't want to put any more stress on those weak plastic points. Thankfully these areas won't be seen. Just need to give the back a bit of a trim. So let's get this cockpit assembled and put the two fuselage halves together. Tight fit, creaked all the way. So I'm cleaning the paint off the seams here with liquid glue and then wiped off with a cotton wool bud. Here I need to make sure I get a good bond. Mustn't forget this part. Now maybe I've got something wrong, but there is a bit of a spring in the two halves meeting. All taped up? Just need to add the two cables from the harnesses at some point in the build. So next will be the undercarriage and the wing assembly. So the parts for the undercarriage. Now the guard has some pin marks on them, but the legs do cover them up nicely. This undercarriage framework needs a bit of clean up. Now the legs lack detailed definition to me, all a bit soft around the edges, but thankfully the wheels look very nice. All the parts cleaned up. Now the side wheel housing has some strange marks and ridges on the surface, but not the end of the world. Easy to clean up. Just add a bit of detail. I drilled a hole out of the leg. I may replace the hydraulic line later. Just some filler at the bottom of the wheels, although you're not going to see them. The parts here have tabs and slots, but there is a bit of give to adjust the wheels to seat properly later. I've also cleaned up the main wing parts just to see if there are any issues with the undercarriage parts. And it's all looking very good. All the parts seem to seat very nicely. The detail here looks nice and sharp compared to the legs. There is a spar to fit here. I must dig that out. So I'm not too sure how much of this I'm going to assemble before applying some paint. I've got to figure that out yet. I nearly forgot the gun muzzles, so I'm going to add those next. We have the inner guns and the outer guns. They suggest drilling some holes in these parts, which is what I'll do next. So I need to create some pilot holes first and hopefully get these centered as best I can. With these holes marked, it will make the drilling so much easier. Now I'm not going to go too big with the holes here, as I might disintegrate the edge of the parts. The outer guns have an indentation moulded in already, so no need to create a pilot hole here. I just want to point out, after looking at the detail on the wings, the flaps around here. I love the way they've been represented. Slightly dropped and a slightly uneven flush fit. Very nice. So let's cut and glue these inner guns. Then the outer ones. Just going to close the wing to see what it all looks like. Looks very nice. The spar is now added. I'm just going to apply paint to the gun ports and any holes under the wing where we might see plastic. I've painted these areas in a dark colour to give them depth. Here we're asked to drill out the rest of the slot so we can add this strut. I'm ready to add paint now, but I'm deciding whether to add the frames to one of the wings. Upper, lower, or neither. Seconds for you out there, but a few days have gone by. I've been fannying about in the garden. It grows so quickly. So I'm going to add the frames to the lower wing. Why? Because the wheel area has this tapered fit, and I may need to do some remedial work around here. So I glued one side and I found that the tolerances were very tight. So I took some plastic off these two slots here, as well as making the hole bigger. The part seated a lot better. So I don't know whether you can see the small amount of Mr. Surfacer 500 I've used to fill that hairline gap. Beautiful fit. So I'm going to paint the undercarriage, starting with Vallejo's aluminium, painted on by brush. It doesn't have to be too clever here, as not much is going to be seen. So while that's drying, I'm cleaning up the fillets very carefully. So with the paint dry, I can add an off-yellow wash to the aluminium surface, a bit like adding a tint to the surface. The wash dry. Now to add some base colours to the undercarriage, black and white. White first. Then black. The wheels, I forgot to say, before closing up the two halves, I've painted the inside of the hubs. Once again, I don't see any plastic colour through those holes. The tie colour mix is black with a few drops of ocean grey. Now I could mask this job, but for me I find painting by brush more satisfying.
All sealed in with a Tamiya satin varnish, ready for a very weak flory wash. With the flory wash added, I've just picked out a few areas with a Tamiya panel line wash. This is a mixture of Tamiya black and brown. I'll add more to the wheels later, but for now I can put them to one side. Now I should fit the undercarriage legs at this point. It will be easier, rather than later at the end of the stage. But I know I'll end up catching them during the painting stage. The top of the wings are now ready to glue. Just something to watch out for are the flaps on the top wing. Now I know these parts are separate, but they're not flush to the edge. There may be a reason for this, but I'll leave that to people with egg on their hats. So let's tackle the exhaust. Really, I should replace these for what it would cost. Far easier, but I'll try and see if I can improve them. Let's start by drilling some holes. Now the weld seam on the exhaust stack is sanded flush, but I want to exaggerate this by adding a thin piece of stretched sprue. The sprue is then attacked with a scalpel blade, sanded back slightly, and then with liquid glue applied to smooth it all out. I've applied a Vallejo's aluminium on the exhausts, as well as the spinner and the prop. Now I want to add some of these parts next to the fuselage, which has been cleaned up. Now the tape around the spindle was to stop it from rattling around while I was sanding. It was a very annoying noise. So far as the fuselage was concerned, the only attention that was needed was around the rear bottom. Just a small amount of filler. And because the raised detail around here faded off, I sanded it back to the next panel line. The spine will be added, and with care this fits reasonably well. By the way, don't forget the light. It looks like a pretty good fit here, but I'll wait till I add some paint to see how good it really is. Now I know this is going to sound stupid, but it's just dawned on me how in the face the surface detail is on the fuselage. So I am thinking of toning it down by sanding it back. The detail in the body style as well compared to the upper wing, quite markedly different. Once again, it's a personal observation. It's not going to keep me awake at night. So I'm going to add the top fuel tank cover. You could add the gun sight later if you wish. This is another tight fit, but with a bit of pressure fits beautifully. Side cowl parts. I was going to add the lower cowl next, but the full wing needs to be added first. So I'll add the top cowl then. So I'm just going to add the other canopy option, the closed hood, just to act as a crap protector, while I'm going to have a go at sanding that rivet detail back on the fuselage. The front detail is fine, no issues. I'm using the Sponge Back 2000 grit. So I think I'm done. I've taken that harshness away, but it's only when I add paint later I'll see what damage I've really done. So the wing is next, and I want to make sure that this fit is spot on. We don't want any sanding or any filler anywhere. Now I had thought of adding the wing to the fuselage first and then the fillets afterwards. By doing this I could adjust the fillets to get the best fit both to body and wing. But after a dry test run that didn't work. They say in the instructions to add the fillets to the wing and then slide the assembly back into the fuselage for the best fit. So I had a go at doing that and I did a dry test fit, but I couldn't get this to work. Not without cutting the 4 tabs off on the cockpit assembly. Even then I had a slight lip on one side to the upper fuselage. So I ended up dry fitting the fillets to the fuselage and then I placed the wing into them from below. This for me worked a treat. I've clamped the wing and the fuselage together. Happy with all the dry fit, I've spot welded the fillets to the fuselage with some liquid glue. With the glue dry on the fillets to the fuselage, I can now glue the wing to the body and the lower fillets. Beautiful, not one gap anywhere. The rear tail is another beautiful fit, just pushes into place. I've masked off the canopies. Now there seems to be an internal framework around the armoured glass area, so I don't know whether to paint it interior green or aluminium, looking viewed from the outside. So I've fixed the rear and front transparent parts and I've applied the interior green. Everything masked off, ready for the AK's aluminium. Just to point out that the carb intake part A17 requires some work to fit flush to the fairing on the wing. The AK's applied all over and it doesn't have to be a good application, only tiny bits of this is going to be seen. So I just need to decide on the finish of the silver painted areas on the spit. I've gone for Tamiya's flat aluminium on these areas, and for the rear fabric tail I'll just add a bit of white to that colour. So I hope you can see the difference between the shiny AKs against the Tamiya's aluminium and the rear fabric tail. Next the white. So I'm just taking some of the paint off before it sets properly. The black. So with all the easy colours on, it's time to paint the upper surfaces. Now the paint guide gives you some help here with the colours needed. For the dark earth they suggest XF52 and XF90 with a 1:1 ratio. Now I tried this and I didn't like the results, but to be honest I wasn't that precise with my ratios. So rather than waste the mix, I added a bit of these two colours and some flat brown. I even added some hull red. So I ended up with this colour. It looks a bit richer now, and maybe a little darker, but it's what I'll add to the spit. So looking at my test pieces with the paint applied, I'm reasonably happy with it, although it may be a different story when applied to the kit. The green is just simply an XF81 as the paint guide suggested, but I've added a little black to it. It's hard to tell under these lights, but if I switch them off you might get a better idea of the true colour. So I've marked off in pencil the cameo. I find this so much easier. So let's add the dark earth mix. Next for the green, and because the demarcation seems to have a hard edge, I'm using thin strips of Tamiya tape so I can get the bends in. I was going to use Jammy Dog's tape, but the edges have seen better days. Don't know what it is with me, but the mixes always look different when applied to the model. It could be the silver base paint underneath. So the paint has been left a good few days to harden, ready to lightly wet sand this surface. So I've decided to create my own markings for the spit, creating a rod for my own back here. Now there are roundels and code letters of all shapes and sizes as far as the eye can see. So I've found an original black and white photograph of a spit. Looks like it's been left behind as there are German soldiers all over it. So this Spitfire had an A prefix instead of a D. I think it indicates the individual aircraft and was usually bigger compared to the other two code letters. Then with strips of Tamiya tape, all cut plumb, this helps me line up the tape to the panel lines on the kit. Tamiya masking sheets are an easier way to go with this process. Then the drawn image, which has also been cut plumb, is placed on top. All this makes sure, to a point, that the image is plumb to the tape. So a very good indication that the cut out on the mask has been successful are the cut out pieces left over. Now, because of the complex curves on the fuselage, I've had to release the stress on some of the masked areas at certain places. Got to be careful here because this may distort the shapes cut out. So after a lot of faffing about, I'm hoping it's all straight. I ain't taking those masks off again. My one main goal here was to make sure those big roundels at least lined up. Code letter colours. Discuss. I've gone with a mix of these two. Now for the white, for the roundel. Sorry, I forgot to show the yellow here. It's a Tamiya yellow mixed with a hint of red. Then the blue, which is a mix left over from the 1/24 scale Hurricane build. So all the masks are peeled off and there are some blemishes to touch up here and there. And at some point I need to add the red dot. I just don't know how yet. Next will be the roundels underneath, then on top, and then the fin flash. The last bit of masking I want to do are the walkways. I've used Jammy Dog's tape to create a guide, and then I've placed Tamiya tape either side of that. Now I was going to paint the gas patch indicator, but I chickened out and added the decal instead. These were mass produced, but I don't think they really worked. They had them in the position so the pilot could see them, just to warn him of any gas on the airfield when coming into land. So I've managed to cut out a mass successfully for the red dots. Now if these are off centre, even slightly, I'm going to be in a world of pain. I should have just used the decals, it's far easier. So with all the markings applied by paint that I want to, just a couple of pointers here for people who want to go have a go at this. The fin flash should have been a lot wider on the tail. I didn't realise this till later on. The other fault are the aircraft ident letter. It should have been wider. I've said this before and I knew this when I was creating the artwork, but for whatever reason, I just ploughed straight on. So I'm just going to burnish the surface markings with a damp cloth. This will flatten the surface of the paint and it will also give me a slight bit of wear to the markings. So I've added a Flores panel wash. Then with oils, I've just gone around the surface just to break it up. Mainly around the wing and cowl areas, as there's enough going on the rear fuselage as it is. And you can see here how very little oil is needed for this. Now for the gun port covers, you can add the decals if you wish, but I thought I'd try Tamiya tape painted. Looking at original footage, the patches look square and were just slightly bigger than a human hand. I've also taken some of the paint off around the gun port areas, as surely the build-up of tape would have had to be removed at some point. So I know this is going to look odd, but I've decided to have one wing sealed and one wing used with the gun tape. Now the tricky part. I'm going to add the legs. They suggest cutting some excess plastic off to fit. I ended up cutting off quite a bit to get it to fit without using too much force for it to seat. These bits next. I just want to show you the rear tail being added, as the placement and the instructions just show it already fixed. Fits in this slot here, and it's just gently pushed in until it stops. The exhaust stacks are said not to rust, but it does look odd without that darker colour. I don't like it. I may add some rusty colour later, and I use the term rust because it just denotes the colour, not the actual, it's probably just the heat that's changing the colour. But as I've said, it just looks too pale to me. Let me know in the comments. Talking of stacks, I had to chamfer some of the plastic off on one side of each of the tabs for them to fit with ease. Finished. So what to say about this kit? Well, I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is the fit. I only used a tiny bit of filler around the bottom of the fuselage. Other than that, all the parts fitted nicely and in all the right areas. The fillets, the wing, the fuselage and all the cowl parts. The rear tail and ailerons just slid into place. Now the tolerance on some of the parts was a bit tight, but for others it just needed a little bit of a tweak. The only bit I struggled with was the undercarriage legs. It's easy to fit these during the wing assembly, but that was a no-no for me. During the rest of the build, I'd have bothered them and they would have bothered me. So for me, for their first offering, it's a very nice kit. My only small gripe may be the instructions could be a bit more clearer. For example, the rear tail, the wheel and some of the parts already shown in place, which are sometimes obvious, sometimes not. I suppose that's what dry fitting is all about. One thing I do love about the kit are the instructions or booklet. Loads of photographs. A very nice touch. I wish other manufacturers would do the same. The decals are superb. With what little I used of them, they went down beautifully. I suppose the last thing I want to mention is the surface detail. Loads of it on the fuselage, but very short on the top wing. Now I'm not a Spitfire expert, but looking at the photographs, the rear fuselage detail looked clean and flush. I had thought of adding rivets to the wing, but I was worried about it might look a bit odd or clash with the raised rivets on the body. So I do hope you like the end results, and I will take some pictures. So I don't know when the next vid will be up. If I can get some very small builds in, I will when and if. So I want to thank you all for your support and your very nice comments over the years. You're all very kind. Thank you.